Hello and welcome back to Lecture 8. In the previous lecture we talked about Demeter and her search for her daughter Persephone, and noticed how Demeter during that search spent some time in the town of Eleusis where she attempted to immortalize the human baby Demophoon. In this lecture we're going to look at the ritual connection of the Homeric hymn to Demeter with the Eleusinian Mysteries. We're going to talk about those mysteries in some detail and then move on to look at other ancient Greek views of the afterlife. So, as I said in the previous lecture, the Homeric hymn to Demeter is one of the very few myths in which we see a direct connection with ritual or with religious ceremonies that are attested elsewhere than in the myth itself. Here we're not extrapolating from the myth to guess that there was a ritual behind it. We know that there was, in fact, a ritual. A very important ritual or very important set of ceremonies performed at Eleusis, the town near to Athens, which Demeter visited on her travels, and performed in honor of Demeter and also of Persephone. The great Eleusinian Mysteries that were held annually in honor of Demeter and Persephone were celebrated for well over 1,000 and perhaps nearly as long as 2,000 years. We don't know exactly when the worship of Demeter at Eleusis began. Some scholars think it may date as far back as to around 1500 BC. If that's correct, then the mysteries were in fact celebrated for nearly 2,000 years, because we know that they fell into disuse near the end of the 4th century AD. We don't have any account of them ever being celebrated after 395 AD. So this is a religious celebration that had a very long run for its money and was extremely important in Greek culture, Athenian culture in particular, but also Greek culture in general. Now, in this context, mysteries means secrets. The term mystery in Greek originally simply meant something that was kept secret. And the reason the ceremonies at Eleusis are called mysteries is because they were secret to non-initiates. To take part in this ceremony in honor of Demeter, one had to go through an initiation process, and only initiates were allowed not only to take part in the ceremonies, but to know what happened in those ceremonies. Non-initiates could not be told about what happened in the mysteries. So we don't know precisely what went on in this celebration in honor of Demeter, which is, of course, very frustrating. We would love to know precisely what happened detail by detail. We don't. We have only a broad outline, only as vague a description as was considered appropriate for non-initiates to be told. A great many people were initiated into these ceremonies. Unusually for Greek religion, initiation was open to both men and women. Normally, Greek religious ceremonies were single-sex. Men had certain festivals that they attended, women had certain festivals that they attended. But the Eleusinian Mysteries were open to both sexes. Males and females could be initiated. Slaves could be initiated as well as free people. The only restrictions imposed were that someone guilty of murder could not be initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, and only those who spoke Greek could be initiated into the mysteries. I'm always rather amused by the idea that not speaking Greek is somehow morally equivalent to being a murderer. Now, I don't think it really is, but still, those were the two requirements. Now, in practice, initiation would have been limited by economic factors. By that, I mean simply that people who could not afford to travel to Eleusis could not be initiated. This was a location-specific religion. That's a rather unusual concept for us, but it's very much present in many ancient religious ceremonies, that in order to be initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, you had to go to Eleusis. You couldn't be initiated into them elsewhere. So for people who lived in Athens, that was not a problem. For people who lived much further away than Athens, for people who lived in other parts of Greece, you would have to be pretty wealthy to make the journey to Eleusis in order to be initiated into the mysteries. Also, initiates had to sacrifice a pig to Demeter. So very poor people or slaves who could not afford a pig to sacrifice wouldn't be able to be initiated for that reason. So theoretically it's open. In practice, it's limited mainly to those who live nearby and to those who have enough wealth to be able to offer a sacrificial pig. The requirement of secrecy means that our knowledge of the mysteries is both limited and quite possibly biased. It's limited because while some initiates must have told the secrets to non-initiates, and a religion that lasted for over 2,000 years with hundreds, if not thousands, of people being initiated every year, it's beyond reason to think that no one ever told a non-initiate what happened in the mysteries. But as far as the written records that we have go, we don't have any accounts by initiates about what happened in the mysteries. What we do have, as far as the written record goes, are accounts by early Christian authors of what goes on in the mysteries. Now, some of those early Christian authors may themselves have been initiated, but then have rejected the mysteries in favor of Christianity. We really don't know. What we do know is that the early Christian authors who wrote about the Eleusinian Mysteries wrote in order to demonstrate their belief that the Eleusinian Mysteries were a false religion and that Christianity was the true religion. And that's why I say their accounts may be biased. Whether or not they intended to give accurate, unbiased accounts, they were convinced in their own minds that the religion they were describing was a false religion. Even so, we have much less testimony about what actually happened in the mysteries than we would like. The sources seem to agree that the mysteries consisted of three main parts: things that were done, things that were said, and things that were shown. The things that were done and things that were said may refer to some sort of religious drama or religious ceremony acted out in front of the initiates. We really don't know. The things that were shown, most sources agree, were the high point of the ceremonies. As initiates went through the initiation ceremony, they went further into the great temple complex at Eleusis, which is still there, by the way. You can go and visit it today. Eleusis is now a suburb of Athens, and the archaeological site is surrounded by chemical and power plants, which is rather disappointing. But it's still a marvelous archaeological site, and the remains of the temple are vast. As initiates went through the process of initiation over several days, they went further into the temple complex, and we think the final ceremonies were held underground, so that they were in an underground chamber. The high point apparently was the showing, the revelation of some sacred object to the initiates. What this sacred object was is very questionable. Some of the early Christian authors I mentioned say that it was something obscene. Obscene figurines, obscene symbols, perhaps even an actual act of sex between a priest and a priestess. Other ancient authors and many modern authorities think that the high point of the ceremony, the great revelation, the meaning of life and death, was an ear of wheat being cut in silence in front of the initiates. Now, my students very frequently look awfully disappointed when I tell them that. As secrets of life and death go, that seems rather tame. But I think it's worth remembering that the power of a religious symbol seen from within a religion does not depend on what that symbol actually is or how it looks from the outside. I can think of no better example to show what I mean than the Christian communion service. Looked at from outside the Christian religion, or let's say the Catholic communion mass, looked at from outside Catholicism, what happens when someone takes communion? What happens when a child takes first communion, for instance? The child eats a rather tasteless little cracker and drinks a small sip of very bad wine. That's looked at from outside the ceremony. How could that possibly have the emotional and spiritual impact that it has? The answer is that the objects used as symbols in the ceremony are very close to irrelevant in and of themselves. It's what they symbolize that matters. After days of initiation in a religion that did, we know, have to do with life and death, with issues of mortality and immortality, with Persephone's descent and return from the underworld, cutting an ear of living grain to symbolize the death and rebirth of all life may have been extraordinarily powerful and emotionally moving. We don't know if that's what the high point actually was, but it seems to me that it at least could have been nothing more than that. Now, the details of the mysteries will probably remain unknown unless we discover some heretofore unknown document that lays them out in detail, which is highly unlikely. We'll never know the details of the ceremonies that happened at the mysteries. But we know enough to recognize many details in the Homeric Hymn to Demeter as referring to bits of the ceremony that happened early on in the initiation process and were not necessarily secret. For instance, when Demeter arrives in Eleusis, she drinks a particular drink made out of barley meal and mint and pennyroyal. We know that initiates at Eleusis drank a similar drink. And so that detail is there in the hymn to provide an etiology for what the initiates do. On a more conceptual level, rather than the narrative detail level, the connection of the hymn with death and life and the return of Persephone from the dead is also etiological, because what initiation promised its initiates was a more happy status in the afterlife than they would otherwise have. The hymn says this explicitly near the end of the hymn, talking about the mysteries. The writer of the hymn says, "Whoever on this earth has seen these mysteries, is blessed. But he who has no part in the holy rites has another lot, as he wastes away in dank darkness." So the reason people became initiates in the Eleusinian Mysteries was to ensure themselves of a happier life, a blessed lot in the afterlife. And so the whole connection that we talked about last time of the hymn with death and life can be seen as an etiology for the Eleusinian Mysteries, for their connection with a better afterlife for humans. If we had more information about what happened at the mysteries, we might recognize other details in the Homeric hymn as clearly etiological as well. Some people think that the placing of Demophoon in the fire must have had some connection with something done in the ritual, but we don't know what that might have been. Now, the Eleusinian Mysteries apparently held out the promise of a happy afterlife for their initiates, and that was a large part of their appeal, because elsewhere in surviving Greek literature we find views of the afterlife that are considerably less pleasant. The standard view of the afterlife, as it appears in Homer's Odyssey and elsewhere in Greek literature, is really pretty grim. The underworld, Tartaros, as it's described in the Odyssey, is a place of dim, shadowy existence, much, much less desirable than life in this world. The ghost, the spirit of the person that exists in Tartaros, is sometimes called an eidolon, which is a word meaning image. Not a person, but an image of a person. That seems to me to stress the idea that what survives after death is much less real, much less important than the living person on this earth. Sort of the opposite, I suppose, of the Christian view or the Islamic view of the afterlife, where in some sense what happens in eternity is real life, is the most important thing, and this world is just a preparation. This is the opposite view, that this world is real life, and what survives after death is merely a shadowy image, and a rather frail and witless one at that. The word for soul, psyche in Greek, psyche, as it's usually pronounced in English, originally seems to simply have meant the breath, the thing that visibly leaves the body at death. The thing that makes a difference between a living body and a dead body, the breath, seems to have been the original meaning of the word psyche. And that, too, I think, stresses that whatever it is that survives after death is rather shadowy and unsubstantial. In the Odyssey, and in other authors as well, the spirits in Tartaros are described as being witless, as not even knowing or recognizing themselves, not knowing who they are or who they were, until Odysseus gives them a drink of blood, of sacrificial blood, which returns their wits to them and allows them to remember who they were when they lived. Now, even in Homer's account, and in other accounts also, some exceptionally noteworthy souls are picked out in Tartaros, either for reward or for punishment. But overall, maybe surprisingly, the Greek view of the afterlife reflects very little sense that one's state in the afterlife is determined by one's actions in this life. Most souls simply exist as dim, shadowy remnants of their actual human selves in Tartaros, where nothing much ever seems to happen. It's only a very few very noteworthy souls who are either punished or rewarded in the standard view of the afterlife. The conception of the Elysian fields, a place in the afterlife or a state in the afterlife that is reserved for a very few, especially good souls, is alluded to very elliptically in the Odyssey and in a few other early works, but really seems to have been a later development, to have developed later in classical antiquity than the time of Homer or the time of the Homeric hymns. The idea of punishment for the wicked is more clearly developed. But even it doesn't apply to the majority of humanity. There's no sense that if you are an evil person in this life, you're going to be punished in Tartarus. Those that are punished are sometimes called the cardinal sinners of Greek mythology, and they are a few really, really noteworthy wrongdoers. Often the first person to commit a particular evil is one of the wrongdoers who's punished in Tartarus. For instance, we have the story of Tantalos, who is an exceptional wrongdoer in that he tried to trick the gods into eating human flesh. As we talked about when discussing sacrifice, there seems to be an idea that very early on, before things were truly set, the gods could eat meat if they wanted to. Tantalos' story parallels that idea because he invited the gods to a feast, and then he killed his own son Pelops, cut him up, cooked him, and served Pelops to the gods as dinner. Apparently, to try to prove that the gods weren't as smart as they thought they were, or some such motivation. It's an odd thing to do, undoubtedly, but that's what he did. The gods recognized that they were being served human flesh and refrained from eating Pelops, with the exception of Demeter, who was grieving for Persephone. This was during the time of the year when Persephone was in the underworld. Demeter absent-mindedly ate Pelops' shoulder before she noticed what she was doing. And so when the gods resurrected Pelops, which they did, they had to make him a shoulder out of ivory to replace the one that Demeter had eaten when her mind was on Persephone. Tantalus' punishment in the underworld is to stand up to his neck in a river of water with fruit trees growing on the bank, their branches hanging just over his head so that the fruit is just within reach for him to pick. He is eternally hungry and eternally thirsty. But whenever he reaches up to pick a piece of fruit, a wind comes and blows the branches out of his reach. Whenever he bends down to drink, the water flows away and leaves a sandy riverbed. So eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, within the sight and smell of food and drink, eternally unable to eat or drink. Greek myth is very good at coming up with really terrible punishments like that. Prometheus with his liver being eaten out by an eagle, Tantalus punished, tormented by eternal hunger and thirst. And by the way, a side note, that is where we get the word tantalize. To tantalize someone is to torment them by showing them something that they cannot have. And that's what Tantalus suffers for eternity. There are other cardinal sinners, such as Titios, who tried to rape Leto, and whose punishment is to have his liver eaten by a vulture, like Prometheus' punishment. Sisyphus, who supposedly was the first murderer, his punishment is to roll a boulder continually uphill, but whenever he gets right to the top of the hill, the boulder rolls back down again, and he has to start all over. And there are a handful of other cardinal sinners. But, as I said, for most people, for the normal run of humanity, reward and punishment does not enter into the standard picture of the afterlife. Now, side by side with belief in the underworld and the gloomy existence of souls there is some evidence that there was also a belief in reincarnation, at least among some people, both in Greece and later in the Roman world. The evidence for the belief in reincarnation is tantalizingly vague. We don't know as much about this as we would like to, but apparently Pythagoras, who lived probably in the 6th century BC, taught a doctrine that included a belief in reincarnation along with a belief in vegetarianism. Pythagoras seems to have taught that souls could be reincarnated not just as other humans but as animals, and therefore he counseled vegetarianism, since the soul of the animal may at one point have been a human soul or may be going to be a human soul. This is the same Pythagoras, by the way, who also developed theories of music and who also worked in geometry, the same man after whom the Pythagorean theorem is named. But unfortunately, not only do we have none of his own writings, there are no records referring to him or telling us what he taught until the late 5th century BC, well over 100 years after the time when he actually lived and taught. So it's hard to say what precisely Pythagoras actually taught, but reincarnation seems to have been part of it. Other references to reincarnation in Greek and Roman literature are much later and are hard to evaluate as evidence for actual belief because of the type of works in which they occur. Plato, for instance, discusses reincarnation in the so-called myth of which occurs in Plato's great work, The Republic. But one difficulty in using this as evidence for actual 4th century belief, Plato wrote in the 4th century BC, is that Plato may well have invented this so-called myth, which is not attested elsewhere before him. He may have invented it specifically to make a point that he wanted to make in the Republic. He tells the story of a warrior who is killed in battle and is thought to be killed in battle and remains dead for a period of some days. When he wakes up, when he comes out of what we would call his coma, he recounts what he saw while he was dead. And among other things, he sees souls being reincarnated. And they are reincarnated according to the kinds of lives they have lived previously. So Odysseus, who was famous for his trickiness, his deceitfulness, and all of that, is reincarnated as a monkey, according to But as I said, Plato may simply have made this story up to make points about proper human behavior. It's not safe to say that because Plato records the myth of people in the 4th century BC actually believed in reincarnation. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. We don't know. Elsewhere in his works, for instance, near the end of the Apology of Socrates, Plato seems to reflect a belief in a much more traditional underworld where souls remain rather than being reincarnated. Later, in the Roman world, Virgil, writing in the 1st century BC, combines the idea of reward and punishment in the underworld, in the afterlife, and the idea of reincarnation in Book 6 of his great epic, the Aeneid. He has Aeneas' father, Anchises, who's dead and in the underworld, and whom Aeneas has gone to visit in the underworld. Virgil has Anchises tell Aeneas what happens to souls after death. Some of them go to the land of the blessed. That's where Anchises himself is. Some of them, really bad ones, go to Tartaros, parallel to the punishment of cardinal sinners as we saw it in Homer. Most souls go through a period that's very similar to the Catholic idea of purgatory, and after 1,000 years of this, drink from the river Lethe, which is the river of forgetfulness, and are reincarnated not remembering anything about their previous lives. But as with Plato's myth of it's very difficult to determine to what extent Virgil here is reflecting actual beliefs, either his own or anyone else's, and to what extent he's using this purely as a literary device. Among other things, what Aeneas' visit to the underworld accomplishes in the Aeneid is it allows Virgil to give an overview of the future, because Anchises shows his son Aeneas a whole long parade of souls who are about to be reincarnated as great Romans of the future. So Virgil may be using reincarnation simply as a way of letting Aeneas view the souls of his yet-to-be-born descendants. This is the same problem I've talked about before of how difficult it is to use literary accounts of myth as actual evidence for people's genuine belief in those myths. And the more developed the literate tradition becomes, the more difficult it is to determine exactly what the correspondence between the literary device and the actual belief may have been. Now, one of the most important myths concerning the afterlife is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the greatest poet who ever lived. He was also a son of Apollo and one of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of creative ability. So Orpheus ought to have been a god. The fact that he was a human is odd and is anomalous. With both his parents gods, he should have been a god, but for whatever reason, he wasn't. He was a human, and the greatest poet who ever lived. Supposedly, his poetry, his singing was so beautiful that he had the power to charm animals and even stones and trees with his music. When his wife Eurydice died, bitten in the heel by a snake on her wedding day, Orpheus journeyed to the underworld to try to get her back, and played his lyre and sang his poetry so beautifully that Hades and Persephone agreed to let him have his wife back. They agreed to let Eurydice go. with one stipulation, of course. This is a very famous part of the story. Orpheus must not look back at Eurydice as she followed him out of the underworld until they had reached the land of the living again. And, of course, as they were walking out of the underworld, Orpheus did look back. Eurydice faded back into Tartaros, and that time was really dead. He could not go back and try to get her again. Now, this purely mythical Orpheus, whose story is attested by Roman writers, by the way, in detail, not by Greek writers, this purely mythical Orpheus was associated with a body of writings and a set of religious beliefs that are called Orphism. As far as we know, there never was any real Orpheus. I think we can safely say he certainly did not go to the underworld to try to get Eurydice back. But there was a set of religious doctrines and beliefs that began to be taught in the 6th century BC that we call Orphism, and the adherents of those beliefs thought that they were founded by Orpheus. The idea that was that while he was in the underworld, Orpheus learned all sorts of things about the afterlife, and when he came back, he told those to disciples who wrote them down and gave them to later humans. Orphism, as I said, began to be taught in the 6th century BC, the same time that Pythagoras was developing his idea of reincarnation. The Orphic writings, unfortunately, survive only in fragmentary form. As I have to say so often in this course, we don't have much testimony about this religious belief system. We know much less about it than we would like to know. We know that it was very involved and complex. It contained its own creation story, its own theogony, for instance. But what I want to focus on here is that these writings, supposedly preserving knowledge that Orpheus gained while he was in the underworld, include a belief in reincarnation. In fact, reincarnation is central to the doctrine of Orphism. Only by following the teachings of Orpheus and leading an ascetic life can the soul eventually be freed from the cycle of birth and re-death. So Orpheus's teaching about reincarnation is in many ways opposite to the standard Greek view that I talked about a few minutes ago, in which life in this world is what counts and is what is desirable, and life as an disincarnated spirit is seen as only a very poor substitute for life in this world. Orpheus's view of reincarnation was much more like the view that we have in Buddhism, for instance, in which incarnation is a bad thing, and the goal of the individual soul is to break the cycle of rebirth and rebirth and rebirth and free itself from incarnation. Supposedly, followers of Orphism did this by leading an ascetic life in this incarnation, and also Orphic writings contain precise instructions about what one should say and do in the underworld to avoid reincarnation. So if you were a follower of Orphism in this life, you would learn what in effect were magic spells. You would learn certain things to say and certain actions that you should take. Supposedly, when you died, you'd find yourself in the underworld. If you said these words to the right god of the underworld, there were several minor gods under Hades, and did the right things, then you wouldn't be reincarnated again. So you had to be an ascetic in this life, but you also needed to know the proper things to say and do in the next life. So Orphism, like the Eleusinian Mysteries, held out the promise of a happy, or at least happier, afterlife than the standard view of the underworld as we see it in Greek religion. Clearly, like in other aspects of Greek religion, in the view of the underworld and the afterlife, we don't have anything approaching an orthodoxy. All of these belief systems seem to have existed more or less side by side, and it's even hard to say how many people ever espoused the idea of reincarnation as opposed to the idea of the Homeric gloomy life in Tartaros, as opposed to the idea of some kind of reward and punishment. There wasn't any orthodoxy about the afterlife. But it does seem safe to say that in most of these systems, Orphism might be the exception here, the afterlife was seen as less important, less real, less worthy of attention than life in this world. Greek thought in general tended to focus on what happens in this life as real and what happens in the afterlife as only a shadowy reflection of reality. In that context, it's interesting to consider that unlike so many mythologies, Greek mythology does not contain any etiology for death. there doesn't seem to be any story that implies that humans originally did not have to die, that death was some kind of afterthought, that death was added on either through a mistake that humans made or through a sin that humans committed or anything like that. This is very unusual. Most mythological systems do seem to contain some such story, some sense that we ought to live forever and that somehow we did something wrong or somebody made a mistake at some point and death was introduced into the picture but ought not to have been there. That idea seems to be entirely absent in classical mythology. Again, in a system in which the defining characteristic of humans is that we are the thanatoi, the dying ones, and the defining characteristic of gods is that they are the undying ones, perhaps death is simply there as a given from the very beginning. Greek and classical mythology in general don't seem to suggest that there was ever a time when humans did not die. But side by side with that, they seem to see this life as the only life worth having. So it's a rather, I don't want to say pessimistic, but perhaps melancholy picture. This life is the only life worth having, but it's short, and what comes after it is less valuable than this life itself.